This is episode 119 of the Death to Tyrants podcast. Let me tell you about a sponsor for today's episode. That is Zippix Toothpicks. I am so happy to have these guys on board with this show. I love these toothpicks. All of my close friends can attest. I have them all the time. Remember when you were young and you would get those toothpicks with the cinnamon flavor? Well, these are like those, but way better. It's like the adult version because the flavors are much better and each toothpick has 2 milligrams of nicotine. So when you got that craving after dinner and you're out and about, don't be rude. Don't just leave the table and get up and go do your thing. Just use a Zippix toothpick. Then your breath will smell good. You'll have used the actual toothpick aspect of it and you've satisfied your craving for a little nicotine. I use these throughout the day. I love these Zippix toothpicks. They got really good flavors. I personally love the peppermint watermelon the most, but they do have a wonderful clove flavor. They've got a great whiskey flavor. And these guys are a very small company that are willing to support a podcast like this one. And that should speak volumes to you guys. You know, the industry they're going up against has a lot of powerful people funding it. These guys are just a small company. ZippixToothpicks.com. Of course, since you listen to this podcast and they're supporting me, you will get a discount. You'll get a 10% discount when you enter code DTTP at checkout. That is DTTP at checkout. Go to ZippixToothpicks.com and I'm promising you guys, they are so good. It's going to be at Zippix Toothpicks.com. Enter code DTTP at checkout for 10% off your order. Let's get to the show.
The crushing weight of the tyrant's passage had left nothing unmarked.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquids, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Welcome back once again to the Death to Tyrants podcast. As always, I am your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson, still coming to you out of Austin, Texas. And one of my most downloaded episodes ever was with my guest that is back with us today, and that's Josh Ketter. I did an episode maybe a month, 6 weeks ago, something like that, on the COVID statistics, because obviously most of you guys know that there's a lot of bad reporting, and the game is always to figure out, I mean, if you can, are these news outlets purposely putting bad information out there, or, you know, are some of them just kind of stupid and they're bad at figuring out how to put statistics into context? Well, the unfortunate thing is a lot of us don't always have time to get behind the headlines and figure out what do these numbers mean, especially, you know, you just see cases per day. Oh, there's a lot of new cases over here. Oh, there's a spike over here. Oh my God, the death rate's crazy over here. They must be congregating and not wearing masks and all of this stuff. Well, my guest today does have the time to go way behind the numbers and way behind the statistics and put them not only into context, but throw out the meaningless ones and really emphasize the numbers and the stats that are truly important. And that's why I'm doing this podcast. This isn't even specifically political, this podcast, except for the fact that I want the truth to be put out there. And unfortunately today in 2020, that can be political because there's a lot of poorly scripted narratives on COVID-19, and they're ubiquitous. And I bet you a lot of your friends are posting some of these fear-mongering articles and headlines. Oh my God, the death rate is so high in Florida. Can you believe it? Without mentioning maybe that New York handled things really, really poorly. So, like I mentioned this on the last episode that Josh was on, I actually don't know his politics. And I find that, at least in this case, refreshing. Because for those listening who maybe don't listen to all these episodes and, you know, they say, I'd like to at least get the truth behind the statistics and the numbers surrounding this COVID mess. I don't want to hear politics and stuff like that being pushed down my throat. Well, good, you won't. We are here to deliver the actual factual information. I said that without even realizing I was going to rhyme it. I want it to mean something. I want you to see the context, to hear Josh and what these numbers mean, and quit listening to these poorly written headlines that are meant to scare people. And unfortunately, we get to this in this interview. There's a very, very good chance that the lockdowns have done a lot more harm than good. And that's truly alarming if you think about it. That's something that you are going to have to hold people accountable for down the road. And just a hint, a little clue as to what the next episode is going to be. You know, those people that lied to us about going to war in Iraq back in 2002, you know, when it was leading up to it, they haven't really been held accountable. A lot of them haven't. A lot of them still have jobs in media. So I think there needs to be a push to hold the people accountable that pushed for these lockdowns, if indeed it does turn out down the road that they did so much worse and caused so much more harm and death than if we had not had them at all. That's something to think about. Let me tell you really quick. Well, so Josh and I are going to discuss a lot of stuff revolving around Texas because he keeps writing these amazing papers. And the most recent one I saw was COVID, what the data tells us about Texas. Well, he's in Houston. I'm in Austin, as you know, so that was of interest to me. However, we don't just stick to Texas here. We talk about many other states, the country in general. And so I don't want you to think, well, I'm in Montana. Why do I care about Texas? Because there's a lot of relevancy in all of these statistics. Again, Josh is so very good at breaking them down and, like I said, putting them into the correct context so we can actually see what is really going on. You know, I know there's a lot of people being bombarded with some bad reporting out there. And so, again, we're here to bring you the truth. Josh Ketter is a retired data and analytics executive who spent a decade leading planning and analysis teams at companies like Amazon.com. He used to build complex models and prepare analysis for meetings with Jeff Bezos and was the primary analytics leader, advising the chief digital officer and chief strategy officer at Target. He's a former CFO, auditor, CPA. He loves data. Thank God, because I don't, but I love the way he presents it. He has built FDA programs and helped launch medical businesses. The guy reads medical studies for fun, so we don't have to. He's here once again, one of my most popular guests ever. Josh Ketter, welcome back to the show, man. How are you?
Hey, thanks for having me, Buck. I'm doing well, man.
Good. Well, another wonderful piece by you and another appearance here on this show. I was mentioning to you off air that your first appearance was my single most downloaded guest appearance ever on this. So that was, people must care about this stuff. So that's a good thing. Before we get into it, and even though a lot of people heard your last appearance, I've been getting a ton of new listeners. So could you talk about what it is that you do and what you have done? Because, you know, there's always these people that are going to hear this, and maybe that's rightfully so, that say, wait a second, why should I listen to this guy? So talk about that.
Sure. I mean, I went a little bit on our first podcast, but I spent better part of 10 years across companies like Amazon.com and Target running planning and analysis, data analytics teams. You know, I managed multi-billion-dollar budgets, which required a lot of complexity, a lot of analysis across a lot of different things. And so numbers are kind of my game, and I'm an auditor, so I'm really good at sniffing out bullshit. Deloitte & Touche trained us how to do that pretty well. So I've spent the last 3-4 months looking at COVID data. It probably helps that I've helped start medical companies. I come from a family of physicians. I was pre-med when I was in college. Not that gives you any kind of medical license, but I'm certainly well aware of medical studies, virology, how things generally work. And so when I started looking at the data, and it just wasn't adding up to the media narrative, I started building some of my own models back in March. And me and my buddy, he's another modeler at Microsoft now, and basically almost everything that we thought was going to happen started happening. And so my general litmus test for folks is I don't really care what your credentials are. And quite frankly, you throw out everything I just said about myself. Really what you should look at is the people that I'm listening to. Are they telling, have they been accurate or not, right? What have they done? And so I use that same litmus test for media talking heads. What did they predict, and were they accurate or not? And I try to listen to those who were. So far, I like to think that I've been pretty close. In this type of instance for virology, if you're within 50%, you're doing really good. most of the folks have been off, air quote experts have been off by thousands of percents. So that's probably why I would say if you're looking for, somebody who's at least been semi-right, I've been fairly close. I'd like to think I can offer something because of that.
Well, I reached back out to you because you wrote another great paper regarding what's going on here in Texas, and that's where you and I both are. So we hear about it, locally on the news, and of course there were a lot of red flags, and the media's reporting lots of crazy bad news. Now, this has been probably a few weeks ago. It does seem to have died down a little bit as far as the media reports go. But
yeah,
you said something that in the paper that I've been suspecting, and that is the actual numbers don't match the narrative. So I would like to start there, and we can go beyond Texas if we want to throughout this interview. And I like being able to state the sides of the discussion, all sides of it. So what is the narrative? What has the narrative been in Texas for those who may live elsewhere?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to just state there's not necessarily one narrative, right? I mean, we have a lot of different media outlets, and depending on what your source is, you may be hearing different things. But I'll say the general narrative that I heard the most of, including local and national chains, was that our hospitals were full. We were breaking. We were the next New York. We were, an epicenter for COVID, and it's a very dangerous place. And that's the narrative that I heard, and that couldn't be further from the truth when you looked at the numbers. And we can get into that a little bit if you'd like.
Yeah, well, I'm going to call there's a name that another podcaster gives the people that are kind of gloom and doom, and it's a take on boomers, and we're calling them doomers. And so I've been told by some of my doomer friends here in Texas that the hospitals are starting to fill up, like you said. It's becoming just a dire situation. So let's get into that. The truth, what is it as far as the hospitals here in Texas filling up?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to understand is there's two major facets to hospitals. There's general beds, and then there's ICU or critical care beds, right? And so for our general beds, we averaged pretty consistently about 40,000 to 45,000 folks in the hospital. Well, we have over 60,000 beds. So pretty consistently, we're like 60, 70% of our capacity, in general. There may be a few hospitals that are very high or full, and then there's certainly some that are below 50%. But on average, Texas has a ton of capacity. I mean, we have over 20,000 beds most of the time, and that doesn't include surge capacity. It's a similar story for ICU. ICU on average, I think, has been about 80%-ish across the state. And an interesting thing to understand about ICU is they typically do run pretty high. Even in Houston, there was a lot of media reports saying we're at 100%. Well, you have to understand what your 100% is of, and that's what they call operational capacity. And we had the CMOs, the chief medical officers of the largest hospital system in the world here in Houston, Texas Medical Center, write correction letters to the media the very next day that these reports came out saying, hey, that's actually wrong. We're about where we normally are this time of year. In the summer, we're very busy. This is a normal time for Houston, what we're seeing in our ICUs. And oh, by the way, we can add another 20, 30, even in some hospitals, up to 80% additional beds to handle surge. And that's what they do. I mean, that's literally how the hospitals work. If we had the same amount of media coverage back in January and even December, we would have seen very similar numbers because we're having a very high flu season this year. And in fact, 2 years ago, we were overflowing to the point in LA where they described it as a war zone. We're treating people in tents. Or in Louisiana, they declared a state of emergency. And, even with COVID where it is, which has not been, positive, COVID is not a good experience. It has certainly been a drag on us. We haven't even come close to the same levels we achieved a few years ago with flu in terms of the burden on our hospital beds. And so that's just not something you're hearing about in the media. But I think if I was trying to report on hospital beds, which they don't do very often, I think it's important to share that context so we know it's not great, but it's actually not worse than it's been before.
Yeah, that seems to be part of the issue, is that we're seeing statistics that we're not used to seeing because in a normal non-2020 COVID year, you don't hear stats on, hey, look at these hospital beds filling up. This is the percentage that this hospital has now versus, I believe a lot of the issue is that we're not used to hearing statistics reported on things like hospital beds. So a lot of people hear this number and you take it, oh my God, this must be the worst thing ever.
Yeah. 100% of anything sounds potentially scary, but when you realize in truth of their total ICU capacity, they're probably no more than 70% for most of these places. It's not that scary. There's other contextual things like, well, what's driving it, right? In fact, the vast majority of our change in ICUs is accounted for by non-COVID patients. Whenever you kind of shut off preventative medicine for 2-3 months, like we did with lockdowns, and basically your hospital volumes drops, and so that you've got empty hospitals, it's not like your medical care, goes away. It's not like these injuries suddenly stop happening. They're just not getting treated, and they're getting worse and worse. So now when people come in, they're in worse shape. It's a bigger tax on our hospital system, and it has to catch up at some point. In fact, some of what we were seeing is that. And I want to be fair. Some of the surge was COVID. There was a real surge in Texas, and especially certain spots, but it was much smaller. It was a fraction of what was being reported in the media. Most of it was other factors. And some of our factors of being stressed in some hospital systems was because we lost 33,000 healthcare jobs in Texas because of the lockdowns and canceling elective surgeries. When you basically tell a hospital you got to shut down, most of your profit and your cash flow, money doesn't grow on trees. They got to fire people and shave off their expenses. So that's what they did. And now when we actually had a need, because we basically went on lockdown before we actually had a great COVID need in Texas. We were very early, too early, you might argue. Now all of a sudden when it comes, we don't have the same number of staffing, and we're actually not able to handle it as well. We were self-inflicting wounds upon ourselves. And then when we report some of the pains, we forget that. And it's, I think that's an important context to share whenever you're going to report on something like this.
There was a headline in the New York Times, as coronavirus slams Houston hospitals, it's like New York all over again. And, a lot of people might look at that and go, oh, come on. But there's going to be plenty of people that say, see, it's terrible down in Houston. It's like New York City. Can you talk some truth to that?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I started to laugh. I mean, COVID's not a laughing matter, but sometimes the media narrative is.
Yeah.
And specifically, Texas is no more than 10 at its peak. Texas was no more than 10% of New York. I published some graphs that I think is really powerful to look at. But I mean, New York at their peak, if you adjust it for the fact that New York's about 20 million population and Texas is 30 million, so we're about 50% bigger. They would have on equivalency achieved about 1,400 deaths per day at their peak. Texas at its peak was about 200. And New York was sustained over a much longer time period. Texas and New York are so, not even compatible. In fact, when you look at the original flatten the curve media narratives that were sent out, right, the visuals of like, hey, this is what happens if you don't flatten the curve, and here's what it looks like if you do. Basically, Texas looks exactly like the flatten the curve, and New York looks like the do nothing scenario, right? And you forget in the flatten the curve scenario, there's little squiggles, right? You flatten it and there's small little peaks and valleys. Well, that's literally what was happening in Texas, but it was being reported as if it was New York, which is just ludicrous. I mean, I don't know how in the world they justify that kind of reporting.
There's an important section in this paper that you wrote, and this is really key. 3 important data points to consider. I want to talk about those because people just want the truth on this stuff. And I think that they feel like they're getting bombarded from all different directions. And they think, okay, I've learned these facts. And then all of a sudden there's conflicting ones from somewhere else. And a large part of it, the issue, as you've mentioned it a couple of times today already, is the context in which the stats are reported. So can you go over the infections and prevalence, hospitalizations and fatalities and put them in the correct context and what these mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first one is infections and prevalence. And I specifically say that and not cases, because cases, while they're great for diagnosing things in a hospital to know how you treat, right? You have to know what somebody has so you know how to treat them. When we're reporting it in the media, cases are just kind of meaningless. It's a mixed bag of, old cases from antibody tests from months ago. Some of these cases are not even real cases, they're probables. And they're such a small sliver of what's really happening, and they're not randomized. So cases are useless. Throw those out. And then I say, when you want to look at infections and prevalence, the best way to do it, take your hospitalizations or take your fatalities, and you back up, let's say fatalities typically takes about 21 days from the point where you get infected to pass away. And we've got a pretty good idea now, what percentage of infections lead to fatality. So you can back into, and this is how epidemiologists do this, they can back into how many infections you have. And that's why even the CDC said, hey, we're missing about 10x of our cases. And that varies. And early on, we were missing 20, 30, 40x, more infections versus the cases we're capturing. Some cases say maybe we're getting down lower. So the bottom line is infections are much higher. If we have about 5 million cases in the US, we're probably closer to 50 million infections. And so nobody should be panicking when you see a raw case number. It just doesn't mean anything. We had 60 million infections in the US, they estimate, 60 to 80 million of swine flu just 10 years ago. And we're fine. In fact, we get a lot of infections for influenza. That should not be as concerning to us. What really matters is how are we tracking along that curve? Because what happens whenever you get more people infected is you start to achieve herd immunity. And even if you don't fully achieve herd immunity, there's less people in the population to be infected. And so it's harder to pass. So transmission rates drop significantly. And why this matters is we've seen this in Sweden, who did not lock down. In fact, hasn't really changed anything for the last 4 months. Suddenly their fatalities have gone down and cases have gone down to next to nothing. And we saw that happened around 15 to 20% of the population getting infected, which is actually pretty close to where we are in Texas. It's where we're now in Florida and in Arizona. It's where they were in New York when they peaked and dropped, which is really what we're seeing with the virus. And so some states are early on, but others are further along. So when you get there, basically the virus burns out. And we've had some Nobel-winning scientists that have validated this over looking at 200 plus countries and a lot of cities and counties, a lot of data. We have hundreds of millions of data points on COVID now worldwide. So that's important. It's actually not a bad thing when your prevalence goes up. It's actually beneficial for the population, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. So I'd say I'm seeing positive indicators there. That's an important, very important metric. The next one, obviously, is hospitalization. So how many of those infections are going to convert and require hospitalization, are going to tax our system? And this is, I think, the most important one, because if we do exceed our ICU or our total bed capacity, we're going to have problems, right? It really cascades throughout our healthcare because other people have urgent needs and we don't want to fail them and see death spike. And like I said, going back to context, you have to understand, well, how is our system coping to where it was before? And across the board, we're doing really well in the US. Our hospital systems are coping quite well. And so I'm not seeing any concerns there. In fact, we're shedding thousands of patients a day out of the hospitals now. Even in Texas is a great example. All of our hotspots have come way, way, way down. And then, the last one is fatalities. And I think it's really important to look at this, not from the date that it's reported, but from the date that the event occurs. And because they tell you very different stories. A simple a real example is in Florida one day, USA Today was reporting that they hit a record of 120 deaths on that day. Well, they actually only had 8 deaths that day. The other 112 some of them were from months ago that they were going back and finding in the death records, which is fine. I don't know if they were COVID or not, but they looked at them and decided they want to report them as such, and that's okay. But we shouldn't take the fact that some database administrator uploaded into the database that day and reported as if those deaths occurred in the last 24 hours, because they did not. And whenever you're looking at trends to see how you're doing, like, are you coming down your epidemic curve or not? You got to look at the date that the event's occurring, not the date that we're finding stuff and uploading it into a system. That's just stupid reporting. And unfortunately, very few places are doing that. Even in Texas, I'm willing to bet, I've been offline in Alaska the last week in the mountains, so I haven't seen as much media, but I'm willing to bet they're probably still reporting that we've got fatalities of 200-300 a day. But if you look at the date of death, we're now back down below like 30 or 50, I think. We're back to where we were before. We're well past our peak. So that's why I say it's important. You got to look at the date of death, not the date that some database administrator uploaded it.
Yeah, that headline that you mentioned, the one out of Florida, that's the kind of thing that keeps people locked in their apartments, afraid to go get fuel for their car. I mean, I know this is speculation, but why would a media outlet report it so... it's like it's factual, but it's not honest. Why would they report it that way?
It's hard to get inside the head of crazy. If I had to stipulate, it's because it's the latest available data. We're locked into this 24-hour news cycle where we want everything now. We don't want to wait. And to be fair, that there could have been more than 120 deaths that day. You just got to wait a few more weeks for all the death certs to come in, and add it up. It could have been less. It could have been more. But they don't want to wait for the accurate data. They don't want to wait for the date of death data. And that's unfortunate. And it's actually ironic. And that's my guess, right? I'm totally speculating. I can't get inside their heads. But if I had to guess, that's what I think it is. And the great irony is actually in Texas, we switched from date of report for death. We switched to date of death, which thank goodness Texas is doing some things right. Actually, Texas has done quite a few things right with their data, which is good. And the reason they did it, Buck, get this, is that it was taking longer for the date of report to get updated and sent in than the actual death certificates that were coming back. So it was actually, maybe they were looking at it like, oh, well, this is readily available data now, so I'm just going to report this versus waiting. But what they didn't know is it was taking so long to actually get in there. They would have been better to use the right field. It would have been more accurate, more real time than if they were reporting the crappy metrics they were reporting. So even if that was their logic, like, hey, this is available now, in many cases it fails because of just poor administration and how long it takes to batch upload these numbers.
I'm trying to, I have conversations with people over the months about this kind of stuff. And this might sound like a strange question, but I want to hit on questions and stuff that people have presented to me while I've got a smart person like you on. And I think we understand that the death rate is very important, but I've had someone who I consider fairly intelligent unironically say the death rate with this stuff is not the stat to look at. It's not important. Why is it?
Why is it, or why do you think he's saying that?
Why is it? I mean, it seems obvious to me that that's how you would measure kind of the scariness, we'll say, of this disease. Yeah. But there are people saying, no, death rate's not important.
Well, what's their argument?
I believe this person said there's medications for this, so naturally the death rate's going to be lower.
Okay, that's good. So I don't know what his point is.
Yeah.
I mean, to say it's not relevant is like, saying life and death is not relevant. I think that's ludicrous, right? I mean, there's only a few things that we can track with certainty, and fatality is one of those, right? People can play and manipulate stories and data around somebody caught it. We have long-term benefits. We've had the virus for 6 months, so we can't really say how many long-term or consequences we've got because of the virus, or some of the other things could be speculative, but it's really not or even cases can be speculative and muddy. But when you talk about did somebody die or not, are they alive or are they dead? That's something you can't really fudge too much, right? That's much more difficult. So it's one of the cleanest metrics that we have. And even then it has issues. And it's more important because isn't that what we're trying to optimize for is life? So if your goal is not to save people, I don't know why you wouldn't measure it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
was kind of,
also, to me, puts things in perspective. I'm a total stats nerd, so I literally have a life risk matrix probability I'm a skydiver, so I calculated the odds of me dying each time I jump and concluded that it was way below my typical risk of dying in any given year. So I was okay doing that. And that's how I make a lot of my decisions. I look at my mortality table of, based off my age, how likely am I to die every year? And then I make sure I don't do too many activities that are above that risk, right? I try and take smart risk calculated decisions in my life. And so to me, something like my odds of catching and then dying from COVID is incredibly important.
Yeah. Well put. Like I said, I thought that was a strange point, but it's from a fairly intelligent person. And I thought it seems obvious to me. Let me get another perspective here. How relevant are the comparisons between what we are going through now and the 1918 through 1920 Spanish flu?
I don't think they're super relevant personally. There's some lessons we can learn from the Spanish flu, certainly, right? But it's like 100 years ago. Data wasn't great. I personally think that the swine flu is far more relevant in terms of how viruses spread in modern day society, right? And how modern medicine counteracts it. Because certainly if you think about the difference between 1918 and now, we live in a much more densely populated civilization, right? We're much closer to people. We have a much higher population. We've got public transportation, right? We have a lot of things that would encourage the spread, but we also have a lot of things that would combat it. And, we're not bloodletting people anymore, right? Or putting leeches on them. Our medicine's come a long way. So, on the flip side, we've got real-time data. Some of these folks were getting wiped out and, didn't even know it was coming. So I think the only relevance in my mind is general understanding of epidemiology, what may have some lessons learned. I think they were treating some folks outside and had great success during the Spanish flu. They took them out of buildings and put them out in the sunshine. They put medical beds in the army bases out in the open air. So there's maybe a few lessons here or there, but I generally look towards the Hong Kong flu from 40 years ago, look to the swine flu from 10 years ago, things that, would more aptly apply to our modern day society.
Hey guys, let's take a minute to talk about one of our sponsors, and that is Lorenzotti Coffee. I love these guys, not just because they were our very first sponsor, but because, like I've said many times, their coffee is so damn good. If you guys like coffee that tastes the way coffee is actually supposed to taste, with natural flavors that come from the region and the roast of the beans, rather than from artificial flavorings like some other brands use, well, then you'll love Lorenzotti Coffee. If you're a real coffee drinker like myself, you don't want these weird flavors in your coffee like key lime pie or blueberry muffin. You want strong, traditional flavors that actually come from the beans themselves, and that's exactly what you get with Lorenzotti Coffee. You can get Lorenzotti's signature Venetian blend. This stuff comes right from Italy, okay? You can do whole beans, medium fine grind, which that one's actually perfect to use in the French press like I prefer. It comes in these really cool, beautifully designed, resealable tins that ship to you hermetically sealed and keep the coffee very, very fresh. Guys, I cannot speak highly enough of Lorenzotti. They're lovers of liberty. They love this show. They support this show. So why not support them by getting yourself some damn good coffee? So go to lorenzotti.coffee. That is LORENZOTTI.coffee. Guess what? We got a promo code, and that, as you know, is DTTP for Death to Tyrants Podcast. You'll get 10% off your order at checkout. Again, that's lorenzotti.coffee. Enter code DTTP at checkout. Let's get back to the show. I want to get back to the discussion of herd immunity because from where I'm sitting, that does seem to be the most effective way to handle all of this. Is that the most realistic answer to all of this to you? Because there's a lot of people saying, we don't need the whole country. Think of that. We can't all be infected. Think of the death rate then. And that's a scary term to a lot of people is herd immunity. They start picturing how many people have to get this. So I'd like to bring it back to that. What are your thoughts on it? And is that the way to basically handle this effectively?
Yeah, well, I think of herd immunity as just it's an outcome, right? It's not necessarily a strategy. It's just a scientific fact. Nobody should be panicking about it. In fact, it's a good thing. And it's how vaccines work. Vaccines help us achieve herd immunity faster than getting infected with the virus. So nobody should have a negative opinion of herd immunity. I don't know what kind of propaganda has led to that. I think maybe to your question of how does it apply to where we are, or is everybody going to be infected before we achieve herd immunity? I think it's important to understand a few things, which is one, whether it's the Spanish flu, whether it's the Hong Kong flu, the swine flu, we've never had an epidemic in modern history that's achieved over 20 to 30% infection worldwide. It just hasn't happened. And so, the herd immunity calculation that some scientists are doing, saying that, hey, if every single person on the planet is equally susceptible, and if the virus continues to transmit at the exact same rate all the time, which we also know viruses don't, they're sharply seasonal, they're basically then 60% of people are going to be infected. Well, we already have a lot of science and studies that show not everybody is equally susceptible. In fact, some Oxford scientists believe that up to 80% of our population may be essentially highly resistant to COVID-19 to the point of acts almost as immunity. So maybe only 20% can even be infected. So the idea that all of our population needs to be infected, and you're going to multiply that by some fatality rate, whether it's 0.2 or 1%, whatever you want to use, I think is ludicrous. And science doesn't support that, first of all. And then second of all, it also doesn't support 60% of people being infected. And now that we've got a ton of examples places like Sweden, New York, specific cities that got infected very fast before they could ever lock down anyways. Basically, the virus has already achieved herd immunity, and we've got data to show that at about 20%. Some places can be as low as 10, some can be as high as 30. There's some variability, but around 20%, the virus burns out. And we're close. We're very close into the U.S. In fact, I'd expect over time, you see this in places like New Zealand, that lockdown eradicated the virus. It's coming back because they don't have herd immunity. You're going to see places that right now are looking good over the next year or two, unless they get a vaccine that's highly effective. They're going to work their way up towards 15, 20% prevalence. It's just the natural cycle of things. So 50 years of science and epidemiology says herd immunity is just what happens. Whether we get there with a vaccine or whether it just naturally happens on its own because we can only slow the virus so long. So that's how I think about herd immunity. I wouldn't be afraid of it. Sweden's argument in terms of a strategy, they don't even say they have a herd immunity strategy. They just say, hey, look, this is going to happen. So let's isolate. Let's not prolong our pain. Let's isolate the vulnerable, which they didn't do a great job of. Let's allow the young people to continue to mix, right? And they actually kept schools going. They encouraged people to go out and interact with the healthy population so that they could transmit the virus, survive, and build up herd immunity quicker so that the elderly and the vulnerable weren't exposed for as long as a period of time. So that is a strategy. I don't know if I call it the herd immunity strategy. It's just called controlled mitigation, which is what everybody's done for the last 50 to 100 years. So it's not a new strategy. That may be what some of your listeners have been referring to, or what some of the media outlets have been referring to as the herd immunity strategy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no doubt. And you just touched upon it. There's the school thing. That's on everyone's mind now. I don't have kids, but lots of friends do. And this is obviously clearly something that no one expected as far as Zoom sessions for schools. And they come to me now and, hey, what do you think is going to happen? Are schools going to open? And I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? If they said, hey, Josh, should we open our school and allow kids in? What would you say?
I'm going to say absolutely. In fact, we absolutely have to, because we're killing our kids by keeping them home. A true fact. So this is one of the things that drives me nuts in statistics or just any kind of planning or modeling. Oftentimes, whenever you become so focused on optimizing a single metric and you ignore all the other metrics, you could be causing more net harm or more net cost than the very thing you're trying to prevent. So let's take kids and COVID as an example. Kids are so resistant to COVID, both from getting affected and then actually having complications, that they're 20 times more likely to die from influenza than they are from COVID. In fact, they're more likely to be struck by lightning than to die from COVID. So if you sent 40 million kids back to school across all the age spectrums, you'd expect maybe 40 to die, which for anybody who says greater than one death is sad, and trust me, I have a 2.5-year-old, that is sad. I'm very sad. However, again, going back to trying to make sure that we have less kids die from total causes, we have 1,700 kids a year who die from domestic abuse, which is incredibly sad and disgusting. But the number one thing that mitigates, prevents, and catches that and keeps that number in check is the schools. The schools are a reporting mechanism. They're also an outlet where they're away from the home for longer, so less chance to be abused or die from domestic abuse. And so even a 10% increase, and there's a lot of school administrators and nonprofit programs that are watching this very carefully. We're seeing domestic abuse skyrocket. It's easy to believe that at least 10%, it could be as high as 100% increase in that metric. So now you're talking about 170, maybe another 1,000 kids are going to die because they don't have the benefits that school provides in terms of helping them avoid domestic abuse and get out of bad situations by identifying it before it leads to fatalities. That's way more than we're going to lose from COVID. So literally, you could say we are killing our kids by keeping them home and trying to protect them from a virus that is 20 times less deadly for them than the flu, when we aren't shutting down schools for flu and we're not shutting it down for lightning potentially striking. I think we have to use science. And so anybody who's saying, don't send kids back to the school, I think is really not following the science or not following the math objectively.
This whole scenario has been full of a lot of knee-jerk reactions where people get tunnel vision and say, to stop this, we have to do this, and then pretend there's no other lingering side effects or no other more harmful side effects than the actual thing they're trying to stop. It seems like throughout this entire COVID mess, from the lockdowns to the school stuff, It's just a lot of tunnel vision. We have to solve this problem without focusing on that then creates XYZ problem and down the line. Yeah, I assume you're seeing the same thing.
That's exactly right. In fact, a couple of folks that I follow pretty closely and I've been able to replicate their calculations have calculated that actually we think it's somewhere between 160 and 200,000 excess deaths in the US right now. Out of that, maybe 40,000 is from the lockdown costs, right? It's people not getting cancer treatment, people not getting acute heart care, and even Alzheimer's. Think about this. I mean, what's the thing that helps people who've got Alzheimer's the most, right? I've had family members go through this. It's being with their kin. It's being with people that they share memories and can physically interact with. So when you start isolating people like that, what happens? They die very, very quickly. And so we're seeing spikes in all of these things because of the measures that we're implementing. And, so maybe you can argue doing that for a couple of weeks, which was originally proposed while we figure this out and get in front of it, is fine. But now that we're doing it for months and months, and some places are talking about it, doing it for much longer, you got to count the cost. And I think some professors at Stanford and Duke had calculated even 3 months ago, we had already killed more people like we're going to in the future. That 40,000 is going to turn into 300,000 or 400,000 or 500,000 over the next 4 or 5 years. And so we have to make sure we're looking at the big picture and making smart decisions. The other one, we should think about this more in America. We're so privileged. We forget our impact on the global economy. Well, when we're not consuming, when we're shutting down shipping lanes, what happens to the world's food supply, right? Now the UN, and they're already starting to see it, we're going to lose millions and millions of people, especially kids and vulnerable people in Africa and other poor nations, because the world's food supply has been disrupted. We'll be okay in the U.S. Maybe won't have our favorite beef for a little bit on the shelf here or there, or some of our favorite products go away. But we're literally, because of our global reactions, going to cause massive famine. Biblical proportions of famine worldwide, where we could lose, it could be in the hundreds of millions of deaths, is what some of UN and World Health Organization officials are warning. So we're so interconnected as a world. We need to remember the big picture. And, that's the stuff I'm very worried about now.
I want to ask about vaccines and not so much from the pro versus anti-vaxxer perspective, but just, it's been said, I've heard also people say, well, this can't be done until we have a vaccine. What do you think of that? And I don't know this, maybe you do or don't. What is the typical time period that it would take to have a vaccine for something like this?
Yeah, my knowledge of the time frame, it's typically at least a year or two, right? It just depends. I think early on they were thinking best case scenario, it would be sometime in early 2021. It looks like there may be some countries like China or Russia that are already going to force some vaccinations at early stages on others, right? Typically, you got to go through 3 phases of trials, and the FDA and even the European equivalents are very stringent on this for a lot of reasons. If you're going to take something and, give that shot and inject it into the bodies of millions and billions of people, you better make sure that it's not going to have severe reactions. So when will we actually have this vaccine, I think is a little bit unclear. Some places, some Oxford epidemiologists were actually thinking that based off the rate at which we're achieving herd immunity in certain places, that they're going to have a hard time finding even enough enrollments to test this, like enough people with COVID, because COVID's disappearing. And it could come back with a second wave during this next flu season. So maybe they'll get some volume they can use to test the vaccines. But the very real problem, a great irony, is that the vaccine that they're looking to help achieve herd immunity, we may already be there. So it may not even be needed. And that may make it hard to recruit enough people into the studies. So that remains to be seen. In terms of your second question, what to say to people who are saying we can't do certain things until we have a vaccine. I don't know. I'd have to know exactly what they're proposing, but I don't think that's right. I think, like anything, context matters. So if you're talking about, my 2.5-year-old, I don't know. I'm not worried about her being around COVID. I'd be silly to. The math says no, so I shouldn't change any behaviors for her. I may be worried about being around my 90-year-old grandfather, right, in a nursing home, or bringing her around him, right, with COVID, because he's very susceptible. That may be something that I might want to wait until either there's a vaccine or until we have enough time has passed that we realize we've already achieved herd immunity naturally, which is what a vaccine seeks to do. So at least for me, that's how I'm thinking about it.
Have you seen any clear indication that there's been any significant difference between states with strict lockdowns versus states with less strict lockdown policies? Has there been big differences?
Yeah, there's 5 states that didn't lock down at all in the U.S. South Dakota was one of them. Gosh, I got a list off to go grab it. But I did some analysis on it a little while back, and there was a statistically significant difference in terms of less excess deaths for those states. I'd caveat that, though, is that, there's time has to pass, right, in terms of the epidemic curve, because if you don't lock down, in theory, you should have more infections, right? It should go faster. The theory of epidemiology is that you're going to get to the same endpoint. Similar number of people are going to be infected if you don't get a vaccine. It's just, can you slow it, right? Slow it down. And lockdowns should, in theory, slow it, not prevent it. So we probably need to wait a full year before we make, strong determinations whether the lockdowns versus non-lockdowns were impactful. But I will say I did do an analysis, and this would be controversial. I've not posted this yet because I really want to make sure it's right. But I've been doing an analysis based off of some policies. You see a strong divergence between conservatives and liberals, right, in terms of how they've approached the virus, both at a state level as well as at a county level. And so I started doing some analytics around that, and I see drastic differences between the parties in terms of their fatality outcomes as a ratio per capita. And even when I adjust for the region that they're in, so that they're in the same region, or I adjust for city density, right, because a lot of Democratic governors or Democratic mayors have much more dense, right? They're the very urban populations like New York City or San Francisco. So when you adjust for that and you look at comparable density, there's still a large divergence. So I want to see a little more time go by before I draw conclusions. But yeah, I'd say broad brushstrokes, when I'm looking at lockdown versus non-lockdown so far, or restrictive versus non-restrictive, I'm seeing significant differences, up to 60%, in some cases a couple 100% less death, depending on the policy. And it typically leans towards less restrictions.
So just to clarify then, for the so far broad brushstrokes, like you said, for the places with less lockdown restrictions, you're seeing less death?
Correct.
Wow. Okay. Well then, if we're back to what we said of looking at the other things, the factors around certain things like lockdowns and the other second and third level effects, if those are worse than the lockdowns, which with what you're saying is true, it could very well be exactly the case, then some of the mayors and governors are going to look really bad historically in a few years.
I agree, if they ever report it that way, right?
Yeah.
I've started seeing some folks get censored in terms of peer-reviewed studies. If it makes somebody look bad, they seem to not be pushing those through peer-reviewed articles. I see people, even my latest Texas article, I was getting a couple thousand views an hour, similar to my last one that went viral, and literally it looked like Facebook shut it off. It went down to like 1 view an hour, like within a split second. It was like something happened. So I think there's some censoring going on, and we've obviously seen that. Some of it's publicly stated that if things that disagree with the World Health Organization, or anti-lockdown, tend to be censored, which is a shame. So I don't know, I don't know what's going to get out. I don't know if people are going to be held account. I hope they will. They need to be. And not even held account. People just need to be educated, because I don't think everybody's malicious. I don't think if you're a governor, you want your people to die, right? I don't think if you're a mayor, you want your citizens to die. I think you may just be uninformed. You may be doing something that feels right or that looks right, maybe virtue signaling, right? And because you want to look like you did something, and you may have unintentionally caused a greater harm. And so I hope that more people would be willing to listen to that and avoid that same mistake in the future, because we can't not learn from our mistakes.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Well, in closing, I got a couple more things really quick. And first, so like I said, for my listeners, Josh and myself are both in Texas. What are your predictions for Texas over the next couple of months?
They've already kind of come true. So if you were to look at our curve right now, our hospitals, I think, are almost 50% lower than when I first published the article, which is what I expected to happen between middle of August and middle of September. So I think we're a little ahead there. Our fatalities have come way, way, way down, back to where they were pre-May, pre-June. I expect to see that trend continue. We'll probably stay by trend continue. We'll probably plateau at a very low fatality rate, maybe like 20 a day. I think we'll probably eventually reach about 11,000 deaths in Texas. I think we're about 8,000 now. So there's probably about another 3,000 we'll see over the coming months. Some of them may be deaths that we missed before. I don't believe our hospitals will actually be overwhelmed. We're well past that peak. I don't expect that. I do think we're going to see some surges as non-COVID cases that have been delayed, pushed out, right? Those treatments, those needs come back. But I don't think any changes in our hospitalization will become of COVID. And I probably expect small second waves in counties or cities that have not achieved 15 to 25% prevalence. So there's probably going to be a few small waves as we get into low humidity season or flu season, starting in about middle of October to probably February. Somewhere in that time frame, I'd expect to see a few small waves, but nothing major.
Yeah, and of course, now, as we've discussed, some of those small waves might be reported as, oh my God, record high deaths on this one day.
Yep.
And then closing then, with all of the data that you've studied and analyzed, maybe not even just for Texas, but for the nation as a whole, what's your general takeaway from all of this, and maybe focusing on the most important aspects of it?
Yeah, I think, my general takeaway is that COVID is largely over. And it has been over for a while. We just keep reporting old fatalities now, or looking at, some of the states that had delayed their curve, right? The 13 states anyways that have been hot lately. So I think COVID's largely over. I expect us to plateau probably between where we are right now, 170 and maybe 230,000 fatalities. And this is over the next, year, basically. We'll see some trickles. And then I don't think we're going to breach any hospital capacity. I think we've largely achieved herd immunity in most places across the U.S., save for a few places like Alaska or Hawaii or some other states. So I think we'll probably see about eight to 10 states this next flu season, when the viruses are more transmissible, pick up and get probably their first wave technically, albeit small. So I think as a whole, the U.S. is largely over. I think we've largely around 50 million infections. So we're largely done. And then we'll just see a few states here or there and a few cities or counties here or there over the coming year have small little outbreaks, but nothing really major. The question will simply be, when will we as a public adjust? When will our governments adjust? When will our media adjust its reporting? And when will we and how will we choose to live our lives moving forward in our society? I think that's the unknown. That's been a lot harder to predict. The virus has been relatively easy. It's the people's response that's been challenging. Yeah.
So well put. Well put. Do you have anything to plug? You got any new articles coming out, or where people can follow you on Twitter and whatnot?
Yeah, I'll probably do a follow-up article here shortly. Two of them. One is the 3 most misleading reports in the media, so people can know what to stop looking at and the right way to look at it. And then second, I'm going to do a part 2 follow-up national on COVID. I call it the tale of 2 halves. Literally, most people don't realize, but from June to now, our infection to fatality ratio has been cut more than in half. And that's a good story. It's sad that we have more infections, which does equal more deaths, but your risk of getting it is going down. Either we're getting better at treating it, or it's becoming less deadly, which viruses do tend to do that. So either way, there's some positive stories, and I want to make sure people know, how the second half of COVID has been playing out in the U.S.
Can you give us a teaser on the one you mentioned right before, the 3 most poorly reported stats, or the?
Yeah, I'd say I've got a few doozies from CNN, particularly cases, right? Cases comparing the U.S. to Europe, and they're not even doing it per capita. It's just a crime of statistics. And if you look at fatalities, our curves are much more close. And so anytime you're comparing apples to oranges, where we're doing 1 million, tests a day, and Europe's doing a fraction of that, it's not really fair to say, hey, we have more cases than Europe, so look at our curve. It's just bad science. So there's a couple like that are just blatantly misleading or cumulative. Oh my gosh, I saw actually a Senate hearing where maybe a senator or Congress, but one of the chairs of the committee was presenting graphics, and she was cherry picking dates, and she was using cumulative charts. And what it didn't show is that the last few months it had been next to 0. But when you show things cumulatively, even if you get up to 50 million, it makes it look like, a big number, right? And like you're doing poorly because you're looking at it throughout all time when you started at zero. So there's just a few deceptive things. This is kind of like we're into the how to lie with statistics, and is playing out on a grand scale right now. So I'm just going to highlight a few of those things so people can know. Don't look at cumulative charts. Don't look at cases, and make sure things are per capita. So you're adjusting for population size or testing, differences.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to that coming out as well. Thanks so much, Josh, for being here once again.
Absolutely, Buck. Thanks for having me.
So there you have it. I hope that you feel a lot more clear on what's truly important surrounding this COVID-19 mess and the lockdowns and everything. Josh is so good at this, and I just might have to have him on again when he releases those new papers that he was talking about. So thank you once again, Josh. Thank you guys for listening. Hey, last week, I'm still a work in progress. I gave you guys the wrong website, my brand new, shiny, glossy, wonderful website, and I gave you the wrong web address. It is actually www.death2tyrantspodcast.com. You can find everything there: Twitter, Facebook, my store, Instagram, all of it at death2tyrantspodcast.com. So go check it out. It's a badass new website done by my friend Bobby Pearson, my sometimes co-host. Hope you guys like it over there. Check it out, and go visit my sponsors. Give them some support. When companies like that support shows like this, it's really cool to give them our support. So go visit them, and I will see you next week. Check this out. I got a white whale. One of the guests that as soon as this podcast started, I said, I've got to get this person. That person is on next week. That's the only hint you get. Until then, have a good one.
You get split in fucking half, till I call the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Death to Tyrants podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.